Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David Jones, and I am 23 years old. This happened in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, deep in the Shenandoah National Park, along the abandoned stretch of trail near Old Rag Mountain where the Park Service stopped maintaining the markers years ago. It was supposed to be our last hurrah before graduation. Me, Michael Williams, Sarah Rodriguez, and Emily Hall. 4 college friends who'd spent countless nights cramming for exams together, now finally taking the wilderness camping trip we'd been planning since freshman year. Michael had researched every detail obsessively, mapping out a 3-day route through some of the most remote sections of the park, away from the tourist crowds that clogged the popular trails. "This is it," Michael announced as we shouldered our packs at the trailhead near Thornton Gap. The October air carried a sharp bite that promised an early winter. 3 days of pure wilderness. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. Sarah rolled her eyes, adjusting the straps of her oversized backpack. "You sound like a nature documentary, Michael. Next you'll be telling us about the majestic beauty of bear scat." "Actually," Michael grinned, his enthusiasm undimmed, "bear scat can tell you a lot about—" "Please don't," Emily interrupted, laughing. She was the quiet one of our group, but her sense of humor could cut through Michael's lectures like a knife. "Save the wilderness wisdom for when we're actually in the wilderness." I checked my GPS one last time before we started down the trail. The device showed our planned route clearly, a winding path that would take us deep into the backcountry, far from the established campsites. Michael had gotten special permits for dispersed camping, promising the park rangers we were experienced hikers, which was only half true. Sarah and I had done plenty of day hikes, but this was Emily's first real backpacking trip, and Michael, despite his encyclopedic knowledge of camping gear, had more experience reading about the outdoors than actually experiencing it. The first few hours passed easily enough. The trail wound through dense forest, the October foliage creating a canopy of orange and red that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. We fell into a comfortable rhythm, with Michael leading and providing a running commentary on every plant, rock formation, and animal track we encountered. "That's definitely deer," he said, pointing to some disturbed earth near a creek crossing. "You can tell by the heart-shaped impressions." "Those look like boot prints to me," Sarah observed. Michael examined them more closely, his confident expression faltering. "That's weird. The permit office said no one else should be on this section of trail this week." I knelt down beside the tracks. They were definitely human, size 11 or 12 boots with a distinctive tread pattern. But something about them bothered me. The depth was wrong, pressed too deep into the soft earth as if whoever made them was carrying an enormous weight, or as if they'd been standing there for a very long time. "Maybe it's from earlier in the week," Emily suggested. "Park rangers checking the trail or something." "Maybe," Michael agreed. But he kept glancing back at the prints as we continued up the mountain. We made good time, despite Michael's frequent stops to consult his map and GPS. By late afternoon, we'd covered nearly 8 miles and reached the area Michael had selected for our first campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks, with a seasonal creek running nearby. It seemed perfect, sheltered from wind, close to water, and far enough from any established trail that we were unlikely to encounter other hikers. "Home sweet home," Sarah announced, dropping her pack with a theatrical sigh of relief. Setting up camp took longer than expected. Emily struggled with her new tent, while Michael fussed over the precise placement of our fire ring and bear hang. Sarah and I collected firewood, venturing perhaps 100 yards into the surrounding forest. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, not silent. I could hear the creek, the rustle of wind through leaves, the occasional crack of settling branches. But there were no bird calls, no scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted, as if the very air was absorbing sound. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked Sarah as we gathered deadfall. She paused, a branch in each hand, and listened. "Now that you mention it, yeah, kind of creepy." "Probably just the time of year," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "Animals settling in for winter." But as we walked back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation crawled up my spine like cold fingers, making me glance repeatedly over my shoulder. The forest behind us looked perfectly normal, just trees and shadows and the fading light of late afternoon, but I couldn't rid myself of the certainty that something was tracking our movement. Back at camp, Michael had finally gotten the fire started, though it seemed to struggle despite the dry conditions. The flames kept dying down to embers, requiring constant attention and additional fuel to maintain even a modest blaze. "This wood is supposed to be perfect for burning," Michael muttered, adding another piece of kindling. "I tested the moisture content and everything." "Maybe it's the altitude," Emily suggested, though we were only at about 3,000 feet. As darkness fell, the fire's behavior became increasingly erratic. Sometimes it would flare up unexpectedly, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Other times it would die down to almost nothing, leaving us in near-complete darkness until Michael could coax it back to life. We'd planned to cook a proper meal, dehydrated beef stew that Michael had been excited to try. But when Sarah opened the package, the smell that emerged made us all gag. "Jesus, what is that?" Emily covered her nose with her sleeve. The contents looked normal, but the odor was unmistakably that of rotting meat. Not just spoiled, putrid, as if it had been sitting in the sun for days. "That's impossible," Michael said, examining the packaging. "I bought this yesterday. The seal isn't even broken." We ended up eating energy bars and instant oatmeal, a disappointing substitute for the hearty meal we'd anticipated. As we sat around the struggling fire, the conversation gradually died away. The surrounding darkness seemed to press in on us, and every normal forest sound, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig, made us jump. "Maybe we should turn in early," Emily suggested around 9 o'clock. "Get a fresh start tomorrow." It seemed like a good idea. We banked the fire and retreated to our tents, Sarah and Emily sharing one while Michael and I took the other. But sleep didn't come easily. Despite my exhaustion from the day's hike, I lay awake listening to the sounds outside our thin nylon walls. Footsteps. That's what they sounded like. Slow, deliberate steps circling our campsite. But when I pressed my ear to the tent wall and held my breath, the sounds would stop. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was just my imagination, they would start again. "Michael," I whispered, "you awake?" "Yeah," he replied immediately. "You hear that too?" "Footsteps?" "I think so. Should we check it out?" Neither of us moved. The rational part of my brain knew it was probably just a deer or some other large animal investigating our camp. But the primitive part, the part that had kept humans alive for thousands of years, was screaming at me to stay hidden. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I expected to see a shadow moving across our tent wall, sometimes far enough away that I wondered if I was imagining them entirely. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke to Michael shaking my shoulder, pale morning light filtering through the tent walls. "David, wake up, something's wrong." I sat up, immediately alert. "What is it?" "Sarah's gone." We unzipped the tent and crawled outside. Emily stood near the cold fire pit, still in her sleeping bag, her face white with worry. "She was right next to me when I went to sleep," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I woke up around dawn and her sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside." Michael was already checking the surrounding area, looking for signs of where Sarah might have gone. "Her boots are missing," he called out, "and her jacket." She probably just went to the bathroom, I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. Sarah was many things, but she wasn't the type to wander off alone in the dark without telling anyone. "For 3 hours?" Emily asked. "I checked my watch when I woke up. It was 6:30. We called her name, our voices echoing through the forest. No response. Michael suggested we split up to search, but Emily and I vetoed that immediately. Whatever had happened to Sarah, we weren't going to risk losing anyone else. We spent the morning scouring the area around our campsite, following game trails and checking near the creek. I found what might have been her footprints near the water's edge, but they were smudged and unclear. If Sarah had come this way, there was no obvious indication of which direction she'd gone. "We should contact the Park Service," Emily said as we regrouped at camp around noon. "This isn't normal." Michael checked his GPS device, frowning. "That's another problem. This thing says we're not where we're supposed to be." "What do you mean?" He showed us the screen. According to the GPS, we were approximately 2 miles southeast of where we'd set up camp. Either this thing is malfunctioning, or we somehow moved our campsite overnight. "That's impossible," I said, but even as I spoke, I was looking around our camp with new eyes. The arrangement of trees, the slope of the ground, the sound of the creek, everything looked exactly as it had yesterday. But Michael was right. Something felt off. "Maybe it's the mountains," Emily suggested. "GPS signals can get weird in rough terrain." "Not this weird," Michael replied. "And look at this. It's showing gaps in our route from yesterday, like we just appeared here." We decided to pack up and hike back toward the main trail, hoping to find Sarah along the way or at least reach an area with cell phone coverage to call for help. But as we prepared to leave, we made another disturbing discovery. Our food was spoiled, not just the beef stew from the night before. Everything. The energy bars had developed a slimy coating that reminded me of mold, except it was moving. The instant oatmeal smelled like sulfur. Even our sealed water bottles contained liquid that looked cloudy and wrong. "This is impossible," Michael kept repeating as we stared at our ruined supplies. "Food doesn't spoil this fast, and these bottles were sealed." Emily was near tears. "What are we going to do? We can't hike out without water." I checked my own water bottles, hoping they might be unaffected. The first 2 were as bad as the others, but the third, the one I'd filled from the creek yesterday evening, still looked clear. I opened it cautiously and took a small sip. It tasted normal. Better than normal, actually. Clean and cold with a mineral flavor that was almost refreshing. "The creek water's still good," I announced. "We can refill our bottles there." As we walked toward the water source, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being manipulated, herded in a specific direction. The spoiled food, Sarah's disappearance, the GPS malfunction, it was all too convenient, too coordinated to be coincidence. At the creek, we found Sarah. She was sitting on a fallen log about 20 feet upstream from where we'd been getting water, her back to us. She wore the same clothes she'd had on the night before, but something about her posture was wrong. Too still, like a statue. "Sarah," Emily called out, relief flooding her voice. "Thank God, we've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that she'd heard us. "Sarah," Michael approached more cautiously. "Are you okay?" Still no response. As we got closer, I could see that she was staring straight ahead at something across the creek. Her hands rested in her lap and she was completely motionless except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of her breathing. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Emily reached out to touch her shoulder. That's when Sarah turned around. Her face was perfectly normal. Same brown eyes, same small scar on her chin from a childhood accident, same slightly crooked smile. But something fundamental was wrong. She looked at us without recognition, as if we were strangers who had accidentally wandered into her space. "Oh," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "It's you?" "Sarah, where have you been?" I asked. "We've been searching for hours." She tilted her head slightly like a dog hearing a distant sound. "Searching?" "You disappeared from the tent sometime during the night," Michael explained. "We were worried sick." Sarah considered this for a long moment, then smiled. But it was wrong. Too wide, held too long, never reaching her eyes. "I was exploring. There are such interesting things in these woods." "What kind of things?" Emily asked. "Old things? Hungry things?" Sarah's smile didn't waver. "Things that have been waiting." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. This wasn't Sarah. Not the Sarah who had rolled her eyes at Michael's nature commentary, who had laughed at Emily's jokes, who had complained about her heavy backpack. This was something wearing Sarah's face. "We should head back to camp," I suggested, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Pack up and get moving." "Oh yes," Sarah agreed, standing with an unnaturally fluid motion. "Back to camp. There are things there too, things that want to meet you." We walked back in silence, Sarah leading the way despite not knowing where our camp was when she disappeared. She moved differently now, too confident, too purposeful, as if she knew exactly where she was going despite the dense forest. At camp, we discovered that our tents had been rearranged. They were still there, still properly staked down, but they'd been moved into a perfect circle around the fire pit. None of us remembered setting them up that way. "Did you do this?" Michael asked Sarah. She looked at him with that empty smile. "Do what?" "The tents. They weren't arranged like this yesterday." Sarah examined the campsite as if seeing it for the first time. "How interesting. Perhaps they moved themselves." Emily grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "David, something's really wrong here. This isn't Sarah." I nodded, watching as our friend, or whatever was wearing her appearance, began methodically examining our gear with the detached curiosity of someone studying museum exhibits. "We need to leave," I whispered. "Now." But as we quietly gathered our essential items, Sarah turned to us with that horrible smile. "Leaving so soon? But you just got here, and there's so much more to see." The afternoon light was beginning to fade, though it seemed far too early for sunset. The shadows around our camp stretched and twisted in ways that didn't match the angle of the sun, and I noticed that the temperature was dropping rapidly. "Sarah, we're concerned about you," Emily said, trying a direct approach. "You're acting strange. Maybe you hit your head or something." "Strange?" Sarah tilted her head again. "I feel perfectly normal. In fact, I feel better than I have in years. More complete." "What do you mean by complete?" Michael asked. "I understand things now. Things about this place, about what lives here, about what it needs." She gestured toward the surrounding forest. "It's been so lonely, David. Michael, Emily. So very lonely for such a long time." The way she said our names made my skin crawl. Each name was pronounced with careful precision, as if she was reading them from a list rather than addressing people she'd known for years. "Sarah, you're scaring us," Emily said. "Please, just tell us what happened to you." "Nothing happened to me. Something happened for me." Sarah's smile widened impossibly. "I've been chosen, selected, honored." That's when I noticed her eyes. They were still brown, still the right shape and size, but they reflected light differently. When she turned her head, they seemed to catch and hold the fading daylight in a way that human eyes shouldn't. "We're leaving," I announced, shouldering my pack. "Sarah, you can come with us or stay here, but we're not spending another night in this place." "Oh, but you are," Sarah said, and her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "You have to. It's already decided." The forest around us had gone completely silent. No wind, no bird calls, no insects. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. In that absolute quiet, I could hear something else, a low humming that seemed to come from underground, vibrating through the soles of my feet. "Run," I whispered to Michael and Emily. We bolted for the tree line, leaving our carefully arranged tents and most of our gear behind. Behind us, I heard Sarah's laughter, musical and beautiful and completely inhuman. The forest had changed. Paths that should have led back toward the main trail instead curved back on themselves or dead-ended in impassable thickets. Trees that I was certain we'd passed an hour ago appeared ahead of us again, as if we were running in circles despite traveling in a straight line. "The GPS," Michael panted, checking his device as we paused to catch our breath. "It's not showing anything. No map, no coordinates, nothing." "How is that possible?" Emily asked. "It's not," I replied, "unless we're not actually where we think we are." The humming sound was getting louder, and now I could feel it in my bones. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The ground beneath our feet, the trees around us, the air itself. "This way," Emily said, pointing toward what looked like a gap in the trees. "I think I see a trail." We pushed through the undergrowth, branches snagging at our clothes and packs. The gap did lead to a trail, but it wasn't one any of us recognized. It was too wide, too straight, carved through the forest as if something massive had passed this way repeatedly. "Look at the trees," Michael whispered. On either side of the trail, the trees had been stripped of their bark in neat, parallel lines. The exposed wood underneath was pale and smooth, almost polished. But what made my stomach turn were the patterns carved into that smooth surface. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes couldn't quite process their geometry. "We shouldn't be here," Emily said. "This isn't a normal trail." But we didn't have a choice. Behind us, the humming was growing louder, and now I could hear other sounds mixed in with it. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving in perfect synchronization. We ran down the impossible trail, our footsteps echoing strangely in the too quiet forest. The symbols on the trees seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, but when I tried to look at them directly, they appeared static and lifeless. The trail led to a clearing that definitely hadn't been there before. A perfect circle, perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by trees that grew in an unnaturally precise ring. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made no architectural sense. A tower made of what looked like compressed earth and bone, spiraling up into the darkening sky like a massive termite mound. "What the hell is that?" Michael breathed. Before anyone could answer, we heard Sarah's voice calling from behind us. "David! Michael! Emily! Where are you going? You're missing the best part." Her voice was closer than it should have been, as if she'd been following us silently through the forest. I turned to look back down the trail and saw her emerging from the tree line, but she wasn't alone. There were others with her. 3 figures that moved with the same unnaturally fluid gait, wearing clothes that might have belonged to other hikers who had wandered into these woods. One was tall and thin, wearing a faded National Park Service uniform. Another was shorter, broader, dressed in camping gear that looked decades old. The third was small, child-sized, wearing a Girl Scout uniform that was somehow pristine despite being covered in what looked like dried blood. But their faces were all wrong. Not human features warped or distorted, but something else entirely wearing human masks that didn't quite fit. The proportions were subtly off, the expressions too fixed, the eyes reflecting light like an animal's. "Friends," Sarah called cheerfully. "We brought friends to meet you." "Run," I whispered again, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing was surrounded by that ring of trees, and the only exit was the trail we'd come from, now blocked by Sarah and her companions. "Actually," Emily said, her voice strange and flat, "I think we should stay." I spun around to look at her. Emily stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, that same empty smile spreading across her face that I'd seen on Sarah. "Emily?" Michael's voice cracked. "Emily, what's happening to you?" "Nothing's happening to me," she replied in that horrible, emotionless tone. "Something's happening for me. Something wonderful." Michael and I backed toward the center of the clearing, toward the impossible tower. Up close, I could see that it wasn't made of earth and bone as I'd first thought. It was made of people. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their bodies pressed and molded together into a living architecture. Some of them were still moving, their eyes tracking our movement, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. "Jesus Christ," Michael whispered. "What is this place?" "Home," said a voice from the tower itself, though I couldn't tell which of the incorporated bodies had spoken. "Home for the lost, home for the wandering, home for those who have forgotten their way." The voice had the same harmonics I'd heard in Sarah's speech, but multiplied and layered until it seemed to come from the very air around us. "We don't want to be here," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "We just want to leave." "Want?" The tower laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "What you want is irrelevant. You are here. You belong here. You will become here." Sarah and her companions had entered the clearing, forming a circle around Michael and me. Emily joined them, moving with that same fluid, inhuman grace. "It doesn't hurt," Emily said, and for a moment her voice sounded almost like herself. "It's actually quite peaceful. You stop worrying about things that don't matter. You stop being afraid." "We like being afraid," Michael said desperately. "Fear is good. Fear keeps us human." "Human," the tower repeated, and somehow I could feel its amusement. Such a limiting concept. Such a small way to exist. The humming was so loud now that it made my teeth ache. I could feel it working its way into my thoughts, smoothing away my panic and replacing it with a strange calm. Part of me wanted to give in, to stop fighting and join the circle of my friends. It would be easier. It would be over. But somewhere deep in my mind, in a place the humming couldn't reach, a small voice was screaming that this wasn't real, wasn't right, wasn't natural. I focused on that voice, fed it my fear and anger and desperate love for my friends. The real Sarah who had rolled her eyes and made sarcastic comments, the real Emily who had been nervous about her first backpacking trip. "No," I said, and the words seemed to echo strangely in the clearing. The tower stopped laughing. The humming faltered for just a moment. "No," I said again, louder this time. "I don't accept this. I don't believe this. This isn't real." "Reality is subjective," the tower replied, but there was something defensive in its tone now. I grabbed Michael's arm. "The fire," I whispered. "Remember how the fire kept going out at camp? How it wouldn't burn properly?" Michael looked at me blankly for a moment. Then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Salt," he breathed. "I put salt in the fire to make it burn better, but it kept dying anyway." "Because salt repels spirits," I finished. "Iron and salt, the old protections." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my multi-tool, a simple stainless steel device with a knife blade and various other implements. Not iron, but close enough. I grabbed a handful of dirt from the clearing floor, hoping it contained enough natural salt from the mountain soil. "It's just a story," Emily said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Iron and salt, that's just folklore." "Maybe," I agreed, opening the knife blade. "But folklore exists for a reason." I cut a shallow line across my palm, letting my blood drop onto the dirt in my other hand. Blood and earth and steel, 3 of the oldest protections humanity had ever known. The humming stopped completely. In the sudden silence, I could hear other sounds: distant traffic, the call of a helicopter, normal forest noises that had been masked by whatever supernatural force had held us. The tower began to dissolve, the compressed bodies separating and falling apart like a house of cards in a strong wind. Sarah, Emily, and the other figures staggered as if they'd been suddenly woken from a deep sleep. The empty smiles vanished from their faces, replaced by confusion and terror. "David?" Sarah's voice was her own again, shaky and frightened. "What? Where are we? What happened to us?" Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "I remember everything. Oh God, I remember what I was thinking, what I wanted to do to you." The clearing was changing too, shrinking back to its normal size. The ring of trees revealed gaps that led to familiar trails, and I could see the glow of electric lights through the forest. The visitor center parking lot, less than half a mile away. "We were never lost," Michael said, understanding flooding his voice. "We were never deep in the backcountry. We were right here, right by the main trails the whole time." "But it felt so real," Emily whispered. 3 days. We've been here for 3 days." I checked my watch. It was still Friday evening, the same day we'd started our hike. Whatever had happened to us, however long it had felt, only a few hours had actually passed. The other figures, the park ranger, the old camper, the girl in the scout uniform, had disappeared entirely, leaving only empty clothes scattered on the forest floor. But whether they'd been illusions or something else, I didn't want to know. We stumbled out of the forest together, supporting each other, not speaking about what we'd experienced until we reached Michael's car. Even then, we sat in silence for a long time, watching the normal world of paved roads and electric lights, trying to convince ourselves it was real. "We can't tell anyone about this," Sarah finally said. "They'll think we're crazy." "Are we crazy?" Emily asked. "Did we all just have some kind of shared hallucination? Mass hysteria?" I looked at my palm, where I'd cut myself with the knife. There was no wound, no scar, no sign that I'd ever drawn my own blood. But I could still taste the memory of that metallic flavor in my mouth, still feel the weight of the dirt and blood mixture in my hand. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know we're getting out of here." Michael started the car without another word. We drove back to campus in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. None of us ever went camping together again. In fact, we barely spoke after that night, as if acknowledging each other's presence would somehow summon back whatever had claimed us in those woods. I've never been able to fully explain what happened to us in Shenandoah. Sometimes I convince myself it was just a shared anxiety attack brought on by being in an unfamiliar environment. Sometimes I think we encountered some kind of natural phenomenon, infrasound or electromagnetic fields that can cause hallucinations and disorientation. But late at night, when I'm lying awake listening to the sounds of the city, I remember the feeling of that thing trying to get inside my head. I remember the taste of the creek water that was too clean, too perfect. I remember the way Sarah's eyes reflected light like an animal's, and how Emily moved with inhuman grace. And I remember the bodies in that tower, dozens of them, eyes still moving, mouths still trying to speak. Sometimes I wonder if those were other hikers who hadn't been strong enough to resist, who had given in to the humming and the false peace. Sometimes I wonder if some part of them is still there, waiting in that clearing that exists somewhere between the real world and whatever hungry emptiness lurks in the spaces between. I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and steel and the constant noise of human activity. I tell myself it's because I like urban conveniences, that I'm not cut out for the outdoors. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I'm afraid of the dark spaces between trees, afraid of the quiet that exists beyond human habitation. I'm afraid that if I venture too far from the safety of civilization, I might hear that humming again. And I'm terrified that next time, I might not be strong enough to say no. The mountains of Virginia are beautiful, everyone says. A perfect place to get away from it all, to find peace in nature's embrace. They're right about the peace part. It's the kind of peace that comes when you stop fighting, stop thinking, stop being human, the kind of peace that lasts forever. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Shenandoah National Park, Virginia, in the shadow of Old Rag Mountain, where the ancient Appalachian peaks hold secrets that should never see daylight. I should have known something was wrong when Rex started whimpering 3 miles into our hike. My German Shepherd had been with me through 2 tours overseas and a messy divorce. Nothing spooked him. But as we climbed the rocky trail toward Limberlost, his ears flattened against his skull, and he kept looking over his shoulder like something was following us through the thick canopy of oak and hickory. The October air carried the smell of decomposing leaves and something else, something sweet and putrid that made my stomach clench. I told myself it was just a dead deer, maybe something the hunters had wounded during bow season. The mountains were full of death this time of year. "Easy, boy," I whispered, scratching behind Rex's ears. His fur was damp with nervous sweat, and I could feel his heartbeat racing beneath my palm. "It's just us and the trees." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. I'd chosen this particular section of Shenandoah because it was remote, truly remote. The Limberlost Trail connected to a network of backcountry paths that most weekend warriors avoided. After Diane served me divorce papers and took half of everything we'd built together, I needed silence. I needed the kind of solitude that only came from being 20 miles from the nearest paved road. What I found instead was something that had been waiting in these mountains for much longer than I could imagine. The first sign should have been my GPS. I'd loaded fresh batteries that morning, checked the satellite connection 3 times before leaving the Thornton Gap parking area. But by noon, the device was showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Potomac River. When I tried to recalibrate, the screen flickered between impossible coordinates, sometimes placing us in West Virginia, sometimes in Pennsylvania, sometimes in places that didn't exist on any map. "Technology," I muttered, stuffing the useless device back into my pack. I had paper maps, a compass, and 30 years of experience reading terrain. I didn't need some government satellite to tell me where I was. Rex whined again, a sound I'd never heard him make before. It was high-pitched and desperate, like a child crying in the dark. The trail began to climb more steeply as we approached the saddle between Old Rag and its smaller neighbors. The forest grew denser here, the canopy so thick that even at midday we walked through a green-tinged twilight. Somewhere in the distance I could hear running water, probably White Oak Canyon Creek, though it sounded wrong somehow. Too loud, too close. I checked my watch, 2:47 p.m. We were making good time, better than I'd expected with the heavy pack. I'd brought enough supplies for 4 days, planning to set up a base camp somewhere near the Corbin Cabin ruins and explore the surrounding wilderness. But now, looking at the way Rex's hackles were raised, I wondered if I should turn back. That's when I heard the whistling. It started as a faint sound, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the leaves. But as we continued climbing, it grew louder and more distinct. Someone was whistling an old folk tune. "Oh, Shenandoah," in a voice that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Rex stopped dead, his body rigid with tension. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that suddenly seemed more wolf than dog. "Hello?" I called out, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Someone there?" The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no distant sound of water. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that suffocating quiet, I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs and the wet sound of my breathing. "Probably just a day hiker," I said to Rex, but my voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the unnatural stillness. "Maybe someone heading back to the parking area." Rex didn't look convinced. His amber eyes were fixed on something in the trees ahead, something I couldn't see. We continued up the trail, but the easy rhythm of our morning hike was gone. Every step felt deliberate, calculated. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes, though I never saw anything more threatening than the patient trees and the shifting play of shadow and filtered sunlight. By 4:30, we reached the area where I'd planned to make camp, a small clearing near the ruins of an old homestead, marked on my topographic map as Henderson Farm, 1800s. All that remained were the foundation stones of what had once been a cabin and a well that locals said never ran dry, even during the worst droughts. I dropped my pack and took a long drink from my water bottle, studying the clearing. It was perfect, sheltered from wind, close to the spring that fed the old well, and far enough off the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed by other hikers. The only problem was the smell. That sweet, cloying odor I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, concentrated in the depression where the cabin had stood. It reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase, or meat beginning to turn in the heat. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, trying to locate the source, but the smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Rex refused to enter the clearing at all. He stood at the tree line, every muscle tense, occasionally letting out that strange high whine that made my skin crawl. "What is it, boy?" I knelt beside him, following his gaze to the center of the clearing. "What do you see?" For a moment, I thought I saw it too, a flicker of movement near the old foundation stones, like someone crouching behind the weathered granite. But when I blinked, there was nothing there except shadows and the slow decay of autumn. I should have listened to Rex. I should have packed up and hiked back to the car right then. Instead, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, survived IEDs and firefights, and the kind of stress that breaks lesser men. I wasn't going to be spooked by some bad smells and a nervous dog, so I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing, as far from the foundation stones as possible. I gathered firewood from the surrounding forest, cooked a simple meal of dehydrated beef stew, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But as the sun sank behind the mountains and the shadows began to lengthen, I found myself jumping at every sound. Rex wouldn't eat. He sat at the edge of the firelight, staring into the darkness beyond, occasionally growling at something only he could see. I tried coaxing him with treats, even offering him some of my stew, but he remained motionless, a 4-legged statue carved from tension and fear. As full darkness settled over the clearing, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. I added more wood to the fire and zipped my jacket up to my chin, but the cold seemed to seep through my clothes and into my bones. It was the kind of cold that came from inside, the cold of hospitals and morgues and places where death lingered. That's when I heard the whistling again. This time it was closer, maybe 50 yards into the tree line. The same folk tune as before, but now I could hear the individual notes clearly, each one hanging in the air just a little too long before fading into the next. The melody was haunting and beautiful and completely wrong for this place. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking slightly. "If someone's out there, come into the light. It's cold, and I've got hot coffee." The whistling stopped, but a few seconds later I heard footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone walking through dry leaves. They were coming from the direction of the old foundation stones, moving slowly and deliberately toward my camp. Rex erupted into a frenzy of barking, his usual deep bark replaced by something wild and desperate. He backed away from the approaching footsteps, his body pressed against my legs. "Easy," I whispered, reaching for the tactical flashlight clipped to my belt. "Let's see who's visiting." The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a man standing just at the edge of my camp. He was tall and thin, dressed in hiking clothes that looked expensive but somehow wrong. Too clean, too new, like a costume rather than gear. His face was pale in the flashlight beam, with dark eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. "Evening," he said, his voice soft and cultured with just a trace of an accent I couldn't place. "Sorry to startle you. I was camping nearby and saw your fire." There was something off about the way he spoke, as if he was choosing each word carefully from a foreign language. And there was that smell again, sweet rot and decay, stronger now that he was close. "No problem," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "I'm Michael. This is Rex." At the sound of his name, Rex let out a sound that was part whine, part snarl. He pressed closer to my legs, his entire body trembling. "I'm Thomas," the stranger said, taking a step closer to the fire. In the flickering light, his face looked different somehow, the features sharper, the eyes deeper set. Thomas Henderson. The name hit me like a physical blow. Henderson. The same name as the old farm where we were camping. Henderson. I tried to keep my voice casual. Any relation to the family that used to live here?" Thomas smiled, and in the firelight I could see that his teeth were too white, too perfect. "You could say that. This land has been in my family for a very long time." He settled himself on a log across the fire from me, moving with an odd, disjointed grace that made my skin crawl. Up close, I could see that his hiking clothes weren't just new, they were wrong. The fabric was too stiff, the colors too bright, as if someone had tried to copy modern outdoor gear from a photograph. "You're a long way from the nearest trail," Thomas said, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Most people don't venture this deep into the backcountry." "I like the solitude," I replied, though my throat felt dry and tight. "After a divorce, sometimes a man needs to get away from everything." "Yes," Thomas nodded slowly. "Sometimes we all need to shed our old skins." The way he said it made my blood run cold. Rex was pressed so tightly against my legs now that I could feel his rapid heartbeat through my pants. "Where did you say you were camping?" I asked. Thomas gestured vaguely toward the tree line. "Not far. I travel light these days." He leaned forward, and the firelight played across his face in a way that made his features seem to shift and blur. "Tell me, Michael, what brings you to this particular spot? Of all the places in these mountains, why here?" I started to answer, but the words died in my throat. In the shifting light of the fire, Thomas's face looked wrong, the proportions slightly off, the skin too smooth, the eyes too large. And there was something else, something that made my primitive brain scream in recognition and terror. His shadow didn't match his body. In the flickering firelight, Thomas cast two shadows, one sitting casually on the log, the other crouched and elongated, with limbs that bent at impossible angles and fingers that stretched into claws. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but Rex's behavior told me otherwise. My dog was no longer just scared. He was terrified in a way I'd never seen before, his entire body shaking as he stared at our uninvited guest. "I should probably get some sleep," I said, my hand casually moving toward the knife on my belt. "Long day tomorrow." "Of course." Thomas smiled, that too perfect smile. "But before you retire, would you mind if I borrowed a cup of sugar? I'm making something special tonight, and I'm afraid I came up short." I didn't have any sugar. I'd packed light, bringing only the essentials for backcountry camping. But before I could tell him that, Thomas continued. "Or perhaps some salt. I find that seasoning makes all the difference when you're preparing meat." The way he said it made my stomach lurch. There was something hungry in his voice, something that had nothing to do with normal appetite. "I don't have any salt," I lied, my hand now gripping the knife handle. "Sorry." Thomas tilted his head to one side, studying me with those two large eyes. "That's strange. I can smell it from here, along with all the other flavors." His nostrils flared slightly, and I realized he was scenting the air like a predator. Rex suddenly bolted, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight with a terrified yelp. The sound of his retreat was quickly swallowed by the forest, leaving me alone with Thomas Henderson, or whatever was wearing his face. "Your dog is very perceptive," Thomas said, standing up with that same unnatural grace. "Animals always know what we really are." He began walking around the fire toward me, and with each step his form seemed to shift and blur. His limbs grew longer, his torso stretched and narrowed, and his face began to change. The human mask was slipping. What emerged from beneath was something that had never been human, something that belonged to the oldest and darkest folklore of these mountains. The skin grew pale and taut, stretched over bones that were too long and joints that bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. The eyes became deep, black holes that reflected no light, and the mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth like broken glass. This was a Wendigo, a creature of endless hunger that had once been human, but had surrendered its humanity for the taste of flesh. The old Cherokee and Monacan tribes had known about these things, had warned against the deep woods where the hungry dead waited for unwary travelers. "You smell of grief," it said, its voice now a rasping whisper that seemed to come from inside my skull. Grief and loneliness and the kind of despair that makes meat tender. I drew my knife and backed toward my tent, but there was nowhere to run. The Wendigo moved with impossible speed, circling me like a shark circling its prey. "I've been waiting so long," it continued, its black eyes fixed on my face. "So long since the last traveler found his way to this place. Do you know how hungry I've been, Michael Williams?" It knew my full name. Somehow, it knew my full name. The others weren't enough, it whispered, close enough now that I could smell the rot on its breath. The hiking couple last spring, the hunter who got lost in December. They fed me for a while, but the hunger always returns. It always returns. I slashed at it with my knife, but the blade passed through empty air. The Wendigo had moved faster than my eyes could follow, and now it was behind me, its clawed hands reaching for my shoulders. I threw myself forward, rolling away from those grasping talons, and came up running. Behind me I could hear the Wendigo laughing, a sound like wind through cemetery gates. The forest was a maze of shadows and reaching branches that tore at my clothes and skin. I had no idea which direction I was running, only that I had to get away from the thing that had been pretending to be Thomas Henderson. My tactical flashlight had fallen somewhere in the clearing, leaving me to navigate by starlight and instinct. Branches whipped across my face and roots caught at my feet, sending me stumbling through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear the Wendigo crashing through the forest, but its pursuit sounded wrong. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, as if it was moving through space in ways that defied physics. I burst through a thicket of mountain laurel and found myself on the bank of a fast-moving stream. The water was ice-cold against my hands as I splashed across, slipping on moss-covered rocks and soaking my boots. On the far side, I paused to catch my breath and listen for signs of pursuit. The forest was silent except for the gurgle of running water and my own ragged breathing. But in that silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Rex's distant bark, coming from the direction of my abandoned camp. My dog had come back, and now he was alone with that thing. I wanted to run deeper into the woods, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Wendigo. But Rex had been my companion through the worst years of my life, the only living thing that had remained loyal when everything else fell apart. I couldn't abandon him. Moving as quietly as possible, I worked my way back toward the clearing, using the stream as a guide. The sound of flowing water would mask my approach, and the Wendigo might not expect me to return so soon. As I drew closer to my camp, I could see the orange glow of my fire through the trees. The flames were burning higher now, fed by the entire pile of wood I'd gathered. In the flickering light, I could make out two figures, one human-shaped but wrong, the other undeniably canine. Rex was backed against a tree at the edge of the clearing, his hackles raised and his teeth bared, but he wasn't barking anymore. Instead, he was staring at the Wendigo with the kind of focused attention that predators reserved for each other. The Wendigo had resumed its human disguise, but the mask was imperfect now. Thomas Henderson's face kept slipping, revealing glimpses of the horror beneath. It was speaking to Rex in a voice that sounded almost kind, almost human. "Good boy," it was saying, extending one pale hand toward my dog. "Such a loyal companion. Your master left you here all alone, didn't he? Left you to fend for yourself while he ran into the dark." Rex's growl was low and continuous, a sound that spoke of violence held in check by training and instinct. "But I won't leave you," the Wendigo continued, taking another step closer. "I'll take very good care of you. After all, loyalty should be rewarded." I gripped my knife tighter and tried to think of a plan. The Wendigo was between me and Rex, and I had no idea how to fight something that could move faster than I could see. But I had to try. That's when I remembered my grandfather's stories. He'd been a mountain man, born and raised in these hills before they became a national park. During the long winter evenings of my childhood, He told me tales of the old days, stories of creatures that haunted the deep woods and the ways people had learned to deal with them. Fire, he'd whispered to 8-year-old me. Fire and iron and the blessing of running water. That's how our people survived when the hungry dead came calling. Fire? I had a lighter in my pocket, and the Wendigo was standing between stacks of dry kindling I'd gathered earlier. Moving as quietly as possible, I circled around to the far side of the clearing, keeping to the shadows at the tree line. The Wendigo was still focused on Rex, apparently savoring the anticipation of its meal. "Come here, boy," it whispered, its voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Come to Thomas. I have such wonderful treats for good dogs." Rex's growling intensified, but I could see his resistance weakening. There was something in the Wendigo's voice that spoke to the deepest parts of the canine brain, something that commanded obedience on a level that transcended training. I reached the pile of kindling I'd stacked near the old foundation stones and quietly began building a small fire. My hands shook as I worked, and twice I nearly dropped my lighter, but finally a small flame caught hold of the dry bark and began to spread. The Wendigo noticed the new light immediately, spinning toward me with inhuman speed. In the glow of the spreading flames, its true form was fully revealed, a nightmare of pale skin stretched over impossible bones, with eyes like black holes and a mouth full of broken glass teeth. "Clever little morsel," it hissed, abandoning all pretense of humanity. "But fire won't save you. Nothing will save you." It began moving toward me, its limbs stretching and contorting as it covered the distance between us in seconds. But I was ready. As it reached for me with those terrible claws, I grabbed a burning branch from my fire and thrust it forward like a spear. The flames struck the Wendigo in the center of its chest, and the creature shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, like the screams of the damned. It staggered backward, its form wavering like heat mirages. "Iron," I gasped, remembering the rest of my grandfather's advice. Fire and iron. I still had my knife, its steel blade gleaming in the firelight. Without giving myself time to think, I lunged forward and drove the weapon deep into the Wendigo's torso. The creature's shriek became a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Black blood poured from the wound, hissing where it hit the ground. The Wendigo clawed at the knife, trying to pull it free, but its strength was fading. "You cannot kill hunger itself," it whispered, its voice growing fainter. "I am eternal. I am—" The words cut off as the Wendigo collapsed, its form dissolving into shadows and mist that dispersed in the mountain wind. All that remained was my bloody knife and the lingering smell of decay. Rex bounded across the clearing and pressed against my legs, whimpering with relief. I sank to my knees and buried my face in his fur, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. We stayed like that for a long time, man and dog holding on to each other in the flickering light of my dying fire. Around us, the forest slowly came back to life. Owls hooting in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the eternal whisper of wind through the trees. But something had changed. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on this place was gone, lifted like a fog dispersing in morning sunlight. The air smelled clean again, carrying only the honest scents of earth and leaves and wood smoke. I gathered what remained of my gear and broke camp by firelight, unwilling to spend another moment in this place. Rex stayed close as we packed, occasionally glancing toward the spot where the Wendigo had fallen, but his earlier terror was gone. Whatever had haunted this clearing for decades, maybe centuries, was finally at rest. The hike back to my truck took most of the night, but I didn't care. I needed the movement, needed the feeling of solid ground beneath my feet and the promise of dawn on the horizon. Rex trotted beside me, alert but no longer afraid, occasionally looking up at me with eyes that held a new kind of respect. We reached the parking area just as the sun was cresting the eastern ridges, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. I loaded my gear into the truck and gave Rex a drink from my water bottle, then stood for a moment looking back at the wilderness we'd escaped. Somewhere in those green depths, the old Henderson place was already beginning to reclaim itself. By next spring, new growth would cover the foundation stones, and hikers would pass through without ever knowing what had waited there in the shadows. The forest was good at keeping its secrets, good at healing its wounds. But I would know, and Rex would know. And sometimes, late at night when the wind sounds just right, I can still hear that haunting whistle echoing through my dreams. "O Shenandoah," played by something that was never quite human. I drive past the entrance to Shenandoah National Park every day on my way to work now. Sometimes I think about going back, about taking another hike into those peaceful-looking mountains. But Rex always knows when I'm thinking about it. He'll come and sit beside my chair, pressing his warm body against my legs, and I remember what's really lurking in the deep woods. Some places are meant to be left alone, some hungers are meant to stay buried, and some whistles should never be answered, no matter how beautiful the melody might be. But on the really quiet nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, I sometimes wonder if the Wendigo was right about one thing, if hunger itself can ever truly die, or if it just finds new forms, new faces to wear. Rex seems to think it's the latter. He never lets me walk alone after dark anymore, and he watches the tree line with an attention that speaks of hard-won wisdom. He knows what I know now, that the real wilderness isn't found on any map, and the most dangerous predators are the ones that learn to walk upright and speak with human voices. The divorce papers are still sitting on my kitchen table, unsigned. Diane keeps calling, asking when I'm going to make it official, when I'm going to move on with my life. But I can't seem to work up the energy to care about legal documents and property divisions. After what I saw in those mountains, human problems seem small and manageable. Rex disagrees. He thinks I should sign the papers, thinks I should stop letting the past consume me from the inside. Smart dog. He understands better than I do that some kinds of hunger are more dangerous than others, and the ones that eat you from within are the hardest to kill. Maybe tomorrow I'll listen to him. Maybe tomorrow I'll sign those papers and start building something new. But tonight, I'm content to sit by my window with Rex at my feet, watching the darkness beyond the glass and remembering what it feels like to face true evil and walk away. The Wendigo is dead. I killed it with fire and iron and the kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. But somewhere in the deepest parts of Shenandoah, where the old trails fade into legend and the hungry dead wait for unwary travelers, I know there are others. There are always others. And sometimes when the wind is just right and the night is particularly dark, I can still hear them whistling. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October of last year, deep in the Ramsey's Draft Wilderness area of Virginia's George Washington National Forest. The company retreat had seemed like such a good idea when our boss, Marcus Chen, first pitched it during that suffocating August staff meeting. Team building, he'd called it, getting back to nature. 4 days in the wilderness to reconnect with our primal selves and strengthen interdepartmental bonds. The marketing department had eaten it up. I should have known better. There were 6 of us who volunteered. Myself from IT, Sarah Rodriguez from accounting, Kevin King from sales, Lisa Gonzalez from marketing, and Jennifer Williams from HR. Marcus rounded out our group, insisting he needed to lead by example. We'd all worked together for 3 years at the consulting firm, but I'd never spent more than a coffee break with most of them outside the sterile office environment. The drive up Route 250 toward Staunton had been pleasant enough. October in the Blue Ridge Mountains painted everything in violent reds and golds, the kind of beauty that makes you forget civilization exists. We'd rented 2 SUVs. Marcus insisted on driving the lead vehicle with Sarah and Kevin, while I followed with Lisa and Jennifer. The GPS had worked perfectly until we turned off onto Forest Road 95, heading toward the Ramsey's Draft trailhead. That's when things started going wrong. "Turn left in 0.3 miles, the robotic voice announced, but when we reached the supposed turn, There was nothing but dense forest pressing against the road like hungry fingers. Marcus's brake lights flared ahead of us, and I watched him make a three-point turn in the narrow road. "GPS is acting up," he called through his rolled-down window when we pulled alongside. "Says we should have turned back there, but there's no road." I checked my phone. No signal. "Mine's dead too. Maybe we passed it?" We backtracked twice before Jennifer spotted a barely visible gap in the trees that might have once been a logging road. The entrance was so overgrown with blackberry vines and saplings that we had to get out and clear it by hand. My skin crawled as I pushed through the vegetation, feeling like something was watching us from the deeper shadows between the trees. The road was more like a deer path that had been widened by erosion. Branches scraped against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass, and more than once I had to back up and find another route around fallen trees. After an hour of this, we finally reached what the old Forest Service map claimed was the Ramses Draft Trailhead. There was no parking lot, no trail marker, no facilities, just a small clearing where someone had once built a fire ring from stones that were now scattered and moss-covered. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the leaves. Even our voices seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere of the ancient forest. "This doesn't look right," Sarah said, consulting the printed map Marcus had brought. Her voice was tight with the kind of controlled panic I recognized from when the servers crashed. "According to this, there should be trailblazes, maybe even a bulletin board." Marcus was already unloading his expensive gear from the back of his SUV, that determined set to his jaw that meant he'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. "Maps are old. Forest Service probably moved the facilities. We'll make do." Lisa had been staring into the woods, her usually perfectly styled blonde hair already wilting in the humid air. "It's so quiet," she whispered. "Shouldn't there be sounds?" She was right. I'd been camping before, and forests were never this silent. There should have been birds, squirrels chattering, the distant call of a hawk. Instead, the trees seemed to absorb sound like a tomb. We set up camp in the clearing as the afternoon light began to fade. Marcus had insisted on lightweight backpacking tents, the kind that required precise setup. In the growing dimness, it took us nearly 2 hours to get everything arranged. By the time we'd gathered wood for a fire, full darkness had fallen like a suffocating blanket. The fire refused to catch. Kevin, who'd boasted about his Eagle Scout background, tried everything: tinder, kindling, different arrangements of logs. The matches would light, would even catch the dry bark and paper we'd brought, but the flames would gutter and die within minutes, leaving us in deeper darkness than before. "Wood's too green," Kevin muttered, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The wood was bone dry, practically crumbling in our hands. "My flashlight's acting up too," Jennifer said, clicking the button repeatedly. The beam would flicker on for a few seconds, then die. "New batteries this morning?" One by one, all our lights began to fail. My headlamp would work in brief, stuttering bursts. Sarah's lantern cast weird shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. Marcus's expensive LED spotlight wouldn't turn on at all. We ate cold granola bars and warm water in the oppressive darkness, huddled together like frightened children. Every rustle in the bushes made us freeze. Every crack of a twig sounded like footsteps. "This is ridiculous," Marcus finally said, but his usual commanding tone had a desperate edge. "We'll get the fire going in the morning, get our bearings, find the actual trail." We retreated to our tents around 10 o'clock. Though without watches or phones that worked, time had become elastic, unreliable. I'd brought a mechanical travel alarm, and its ticking seemed to echo through the forest like a heartbeat. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the screaming started. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been human. The sound was too raw, too primal, like someone had combined the death cry of a deer with the shriek of rusted metal being torn apart. It echoed through the trees from somewhere deeper in the forest, seeming to come from every direction at once. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering against my ribs. Outside my thin tent walls, I could hear the others stirring, frightened whispers carrying in the still air. "What the hell was that?" Kevin's voice tight with terror. "Just an animal," Marcus replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "Mountain lion, maybe, or a fox." The screaming came again, closer this time, and definitely not from any animal I'd ever heard. It had an almost musical quality to it, like a song played on an instrument made of bones and suffering. Lisa started crying in her tent, soft sobs that she tried to muffle. Then silence. The kind of profound quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you strain to hear anything. Your own breathing, your heartbeat, the rustle of your sleeping bag. But there was nothing. I must have dozed fitfully because I was jarred awake by Jennifer's voice calling from outside. "Has anyone seen Sarah?" Dawn was just beginning to filter through the canopy, turning everything gray and ghostly. I unzipped my tent to find Jennifer standing in the middle of our camp, still in her pajamas, hugging herself against the morning chill. "She's not in her tent," Jennifer continued, voice rising with panic. "Her sleeping bag's unzipped from the inside, but she's not here." We searched the immediate area, calling her name. Her boots were still by her tent. Her jacket hung on a nearby branch where she'd left it. But Sarah Rodriguez had vanished without a trace. "Maybe she went to find some privacy," Kevin suggested. But we all knew that was wishful thinking. Sarah was methodical, cautious. She would never have wandered off alone in the dark without her shoes. "We need to find the trail," Marcus said, taking charge again. "Get to a ranger station, report this properly." But when we consulted the map and compass, nothing made sense. According to our bearings, we should have been able to see the main trail just a few hundred yards to the east. Instead, we found only more dense forest. Trees so thick they blocked out most of the sky. We spent the morning searching, following what looked like game trails that led nowhere, finding ourselves back at our campsite again and again, despite following our compass carefully. It was as if the forest was rearranging itself around us. Around noon, we heard Sarah calling. Her voice drifted through the trees from the south, faint but unmistakably hers. "Help! Over here!" We crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, thorns tearing at our clothes, roots catching our feet. The calls continued, always seeming to come from just ahead, just out of sight. "Sarah!" Marcus shouted. "Keep calling. We're coming." But when we finally broke into a small clearing, we found only an old campsite. The fire ring was made from stones blackened with age, filled with ashes that looked decades old. Scattered around it were the remnants of camping gear. A collapsed tent so faded and rotted it was impossible to tell what color it had originally been. The rusted frame of a backpack, and something that made my stomach clench. A collection of bones arranged in a neat pile beside the dead fire. They were too small to be human, too large to be from rabbits or squirrels. But they'd been carefully cleaned, picked completely free of meat, and arranged with an almost ritualistic precision. "Sarah!" Jennifer called again, her voice cracking. But there was no answer. The forest had gone silent again. We returned to our own camp shaken and confused. That evening, we managed to get a fire started. The wood caught immediately this time, burning with normal orange flames that provided blessed warmth and light. Our electronic devices still refused to work, but at least we weren't trapped in complete darkness. "In the morning, we hike out," Marcus declared. "Follow the stream downhill. Has to lead somewhere." But Lisa wasn't paying attention to his planning. She was staring into the fire with an odd expression, her head tilted like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly. "Hear what?" Kevin moved closer to her. "The singing." I strained my ears but heard nothing beyond the crackle of flames and the distant sound of water moving over rocks. "I don't—" "There," Lisa interrupted, pointing into the darkness beyond our firelight. "Can't you hear it? It's beautiful." And then, God help me, I could hear it. Faint at first, like a half-remembered melody from childhood, but growing stronger. A woman's voice, singing something wordless and haunting that made my chest ache with longing. It was coming from deeper in the forest, from the direction of that old campsite we'd found. "Sarah," Jennifer breathed. "That's Sarah singing." Lisa stood up abruptly, her movements jerky like a marionette. "She wants us to come find her." "Lisa, sit down," Marcus ordered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. He could hear it too now. We all could. The singing was getting louder, more insistent, and underneath it was something else. A sound like wind through dry leaves, like whispered words in a language that predated human speech. Lisa took a step toward the darkness. "Lisa, stop!" I grabbed her arm and her skin was ice cold despite the warmth of the fire. When she turned to look at me, her pupils were dilated to black pools that reflected the firelight like an animal's. "She's calling to us," Lisa said, her voice dreamy and distant. "She's so hungry, Brian. She's been hungry for so long." The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. In that silence, we heard footsteps approaching through the forest. Slow, deliberate, the sound of someone walking barefoot through the leaves. "Sarah," Marcus called, grabbing a flashlight that actually worked this time. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees at the edge of our clearing. And then she stepped into the light. It was Sarah. Unmistakably, her dark hair, her slight build, the red jacket she'd been wearing yesterday. But everything about her was wrong. She moved with a strange gliding gait that didn't quite touch the ground. Her skin was pale as birch bark, almost luminous in the flashlight beam. And her smile? Her smile was too wide. Too many teeth, sharp as broken glass extending far beyond the corners of her mouth. When she opened it to speak, I saw that her tongue was black and too long, lolling out like a dog's. "Found you," she said, and her voice was Sarah's voice layered with something else. The sound of wind through empty houses, of animals dying in the cold. Lisa stepped toward her. "Sarah, we've been looking everywhere for—" "Lisa, no!" I yanked her backward just as Sarah's head snapped toward us with an inhuman speed that would have broken a real person's neck. In the flashlight beam, I could see that her eyes were completely black, and when she smiled wider, I realized her jaw was dislocated, hanging open at an impossible angle. "So hungry," the thing wearing Sarah's face said. "So very, very hungry." Kevin stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. "What the fuck is that thing?" The Sarah thing's head swiveled toward him, moving with the fluid motion of a snake. "Kevin," it said lovingly. "Sweet Kevin, come here." But Kevin was already running, crashing through the forest in blind panic. The thing that had been Sarah watched him go with amusement, then turned back to the rest of us. "You can't all run," it said reasonably. "Some of you have to stay and play." Marcus, to his credit, tried to take charge even in the face of the impossible. "I don't know what you are, but you're not Sarah. Where is she? What did you do with her?" The thing laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with crying children. "Oh, she's here. She's right here with me." It tapped its chest with one finger, and I saw that its fingernails had grown into black claws. "She's keeping me company. She has such interesting memories. Did you know she was afraid of the dark as a child? She had a nightlight until she was 15. Jennifer was hyperventilating beside me, making small, wounded animal sounds. Lisa had gone completely still, staring at the creature with fascination rather than fear. "What are you?" I managed to ask. The thing tilted its head, considering. "Hungry," it said simply. "I've been so hungry for so long. Do you know what it's like to be hungry for decades? To waste away to nothing, waiting for someone to wander close enough?" It took a step toward us, and I could smell it now, the cloying sweetness of rotting meat mixed with something chemical and wrong, like antifreeze. "But you came," it continued conversationally, "and you brought such lovely dreams with you, such delicious fears. Sarah was just the appetizer. The thing's form flickered for a moment, like a bad television signal, and for just an instant I saw what it really was underneath Sarah's stolen face. Something impossibly tall and thin, all joints and angles and teeth, with skin like bark and eyes like holes burned through paper. Then it was Sarah again, beautiful and terrible and wrong. "Lisa," it said sweetly. "Lisa, darling, come here." And Lisa stepped forward. "Lisa, don't." I reached for her, but she was already moving, drawn like a moth to flame. The thing opened its arms wide in welcome, and I saw that its embrace would tear her apart. Those weren't arms anymore, but something like tree branches, covered in thorns and wet with sap that looked too much like blood. Jennifer broke first. She turned and ran into the forest, her panicked breathing fading into the distance. That left just Marcus, Lisa, and me facing down something that shouldn't exist. "The fire," Marcus whispered urgently. "It doesn't like the fire." He was right. The thing, I couldn't think of it as Sarah anymore, had stayed just at the edge of our firelight, never stepping fully into the warm glow. But Lisa was walking toward it, mesmerized, and in seconds she'd be beyond our help. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and lunged forward, swinging it like a club. The thing shrieked, that same inhuman sound we'd heard the night before, and recoiled, Sarah's stolen face melting like wax to reveal something underneath that hurt to look at directly. "Lisa, run!" She stumbled backward, finally breaking free of whatever spell the creature had woven around her. Marcus grabbed her hand and they bolted into the forest, leaving me alone with the thing that wore Sarah's face. It recovered quickly, Sarah's features reforming like smoke. "That wasn't very nice, Brian," it said, and now its voice had lost all pretense of humanity. It sounded like wind through a graveyard, like the last breath of dying things. I backed toward the fire, holding the burning branch like a weapon. "What do you want?" "I told you, I'm hungry." It began to circle me, staying just outside the reach of my makeshift torch. "Do you know how long it's been since someone came to my forest? Since I had fresh meat to wear? You're not Sarah." "No," it agreed sadly. "Poor Sarah. She tried so hard to get away when I found her this morning, running through the trees in her bare feet, calling for help. But there's no help here, Brian. There's only me." I could hear Kevin somewhere in the distance, still crashing through the underbrush, his panicked breathing echoing off the trees. The thing heard it too, its head turning toward the sound with predatory interest. "He's afraid," it mused. "Fear makes the meat so much sweeter." "Why us?" I demanded. "Why now?" "Because you came," it said simply. "Because you lit a fire in my forest, and the fire called to me. Because you brought your delicious little fears and dreams and memories, and I haven't fed in so very long." The burning branch was getting shorter, the flames eating down toward my hand. Soon, I'd have no protection at all. "What are you?" I asked again. This time it smiled with genuine pleasure. "I am what happens when hunger lives long enough to grow teeth. I am the space between one breath and the next. I am the thing that waits in the dark corners of the world, patient as stone, until someone gets lost enough to find me." The branch was almost burned down to nothing. I could feel the heat against my fingers, smell the charring wood and my own singed skin. In moments, I'd be defenseless. That's when I heard the gunshot. It echoed through the forest like thunder, and the thing wearing Sarah's face spun toward the sound with inhuman speed. For a moment, its stolen features flickered and I saw the true horror underneath. Something made of shadow and bone and terrible hunger, so wrong that my mind tried to reject what I was seeing. Another gunshot, closer this time, and then I heard voices calling through the trees. Human voices, rough with authority and purpose. "Forest Service!" someone shouted. "Anyone out there?" The thing hissed like steam escaping from a punctured tank. Sarah's face melted away completely, leaving something that belonged in nightmares. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in directions that made my eyes water. It looked at me with eyes like burnt holes and spoke in a voice like grinding bones. This isn't over. Then it was gone, not running, but simply ceasing to exist, leaving only the smell of rot and the memory of terror. The search team found me 20 minutes later, huddled by the dying fire with the burned-down stick still clutched in my hands. 3 Forest Service rangers and a local sheriff's deputy, all carrying heavy-duty flashlights and wearing expressions of grim professionalism. "Sir, are you hurt?" The lead ranger was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. "We've been looking for your group since yesterday. Someone called in your license plates as abandoned on Forest Road 95. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled whisper. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming for hours. "Take your time," she said gently. "We found 2 of your companions already, a man and a woman. Pretty shaken up, but unharmed. They told us there were others. Sarah, I managed, and Jennifer. It took Sarah." The rangers exchanged glances. "Sir, what thing?" But how could I explain? How could I tell them about something that wore stolen faces and fed on fear? They'd think I was in shock, hallucinating from exposure and terror. "I don't know," I said finally. "Something in the woods. Sarah's gone." They found Kevin 3 hours later, curled up in a hollow log 2 miles away, catatonic with terror. His hair had gone completely white overnight. Jennifer was discovered at dawn, wandering along a hiking trail 5 miles from our campsite, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. But we never found Sarah Rodriguez. The official report blamed exposure and panic. "Hikers become disoriented in dense forest," the ranger explained to me later in the hospital. "Start hallucinating, making poor decisions. Happens more often than you'd think. We'll keep looking for your friend, but—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They did keep looking, for almost 2 weeks. The search teams combed every square mile of Ramsey's Draft Wilderness, following every trail and game path. They brought in tracking dogs and helicopters with thermal imaging. They drained the beaver ponds and checked every cave and rock shelter. They found nothing. No trace, no sign, no body. Sarah Rodriguez had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Marcus quit the company a month later and moved to Florida. Kevin spent 6 weeks in a psychiatric facility and still won't talk about what happened in the woods. Jennifer went back to work like nothing had happened, but I've seen her checking over her shoulder when she thinks no one's looking. Lisa was the worst affected. She developed an obsession with missing persons cases, spending hours online reading about people who'd vanished in wilderness areas. She'd cornered me in the break room a few weeks after we got back, her eyes bright with fever. "It's still out there," she'd whispered. "I can feel it calling to me sometimes, in my dreams. It knows we got away." She took early retirement in December and moved to Arizona. I get a postcard from her every few months, always desert landscapes, always with messages about how good it is to see the horizon in every direction. As for me, I've done my research too, though I wish I hadn't. Ramsey's Draft Wilderness has a history. Native American tribes avoided the area for centuries, calling it the place where hunger lives. Early settlers reported missing livestock and strange sounds in the night. Since the 1950s, 17 people have vanished in that stretch of forest. All experienced hikers or hunters, all simply gone without a trace. The locals have a name for it, though they don't like to say it out loud: the Wendigo of Ramsey's Draft. They say it sleeps for years at a time, patient as stone, until someone lights a fire in its territory. Then it wakes up hungry. I've tried to move on, tried to forget, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I hear singing in the distance. A woman's voice, beautiful and haunting, calling from somewhere deep in the darkness. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that it's still waiting out there in the woods. Still hungry, still patient as stone, still wearing Sarah's face, Last week, I got a phone call. The caller ID was blocked, but when I answered, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone savoring the sound of my voice saying hello. Then, in Sarah's voice, sweet, familiar, terribly wrong, "I miss you, Brian. Come back to the woods. Come back and play." The line went dead. I've been looking at maps of desert areas out west, places where you can see for miles in every direction, where the darkness never gets thick enough to hide the things that wait in the spaces between trees, places where the hungry things can't follow. But sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come, I wonder if distance really matters. If something that can wear stolen faces and speak with the voices of the dead really cares about state lines and geography. I wonder if I'll ever be far enough away to feel safe again. And in my darkest moments, when the memory of that thing's black eyes and too wide smile haunts my dreams, I wonder if Sarah Rodriguez is still in there somewhere, trapped inside that ancient hunger, watching helplessly as it uses her face to lure others into the dark. The thought keeps me awake at night, the thought that she might still be screaming. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of George Washington National Forest, deep in the Massanutten Mountains of Virginia, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my coworkers in October 2024. The four of us from Meridian Tech Solutions had been planning this trip for months. Jennifer Davis from accounting, always the organizer, had researched the perfect spot, a supposedly pristine area near Signal Knob, accessible only by a grueling 6-mile hike through dense forest. Robert Johnson from IT, quiet and methodical, had handled all the gear logistics with his typical obsessive attention to detail. Sarah Rodriguez from marketing brought her infectious enthusiasm and enough trail mix to feed a small army. And me? I just wanted to disconnect from the endless stream of emails and deadlines that had been consuming my life. We should have paid attention to the warnings. The trail started normal enough. The October air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the faint sweetness of dying wild flowers. Bare branches created a skeletal canopy overhead, allowing shafts of pale sunlight to pierce through in scattered patches. The forest floor crunched beneath our boots, a satisfying sound that made the city feel like a distant memory. "GPS says we're making good time," Robert announced, squinting at his phone screen. He was always checking something: elevation, distance, weather updates. The man lived by data. "When was the last time you just looked around without measuring it?" Sarah teased, adjusting her bright red backpack. Even in the wilderness, she maintained that vibrant energy that made her so effective in client presentations. "When I can afford to get lost," Robert replied, not looking up from his device. Jennifer laughed, the sound echoing strangely among the trees. "Relax, Rob. Jen's got this mapped out perfectly." "Right, Jen." But I was watching the forest, and something felt wrong. The trees seemed too quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just our footsteps and breathing, unnaturally loud in the silence. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" I asked. Sarah paused, tilting her head. "Now that you mention it, yeah. Where are all the squirrels? The birds?" "Seasonal migration," Robert said automatically, perfectly normal for this time of year. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. We pressed on. The trail grew narrower, more overgrown. Thorny vines reached across the path like grasping fingers, and more than once I felt them snag my jacket with what seemed like deliberate intent. The afternoon light was fading faster than it should have, filtered through increasingly dense canopy. "According to this, we should be coming up on White Oak Run soon," Jennifer said, consulting her map. "There's supposed to be a clearing just past it where we can set up camp." Robert frowned at his phone. "That's weird. My GPS keeps jumping around. Shows us in 3 different locations." "Mountain interference," I suggested, but my stomach was starting to clench with an inexplicable anxiety. Or dead battery, Sarah added. When's the last time you charged that thing? This morning, full battery. Robert shook the device as if that might fix whatever was wrong with it. Now it's showing 12%. The sound of water reached us before we saw the stream. White Oak Run, presumably. But when we emerged from the trees, what we found wasn't the gentle creek Jennifer had described from her research. This was a black torrent, swollen with recent rains, rushing between moss-covered boulders with a violence that seemed almost angry. This isn't right, Jennifer said, comparing the scene to her guidebook. The pictures show a shallow stream you can practically step across. Sarah knelt by the water's edge, dipping her fingers in and immediately jerking them back. Jesus, that's cold. And it smells wrong. She was right. Instead of the clean, mineral scent of mountain water, this stream carried an odor like rotting meat mixed with sulfur, the kind of smell that triggers some primal alarm in your brainstem. We need to cross it to reach the campsite, Jennifer said, though her voice carried none of its earlier certainty. Robert was still fighting with his phone. This thing is completely dead now, and my backup battery pack isn't working either. Mine too, Sarah said, pulling out her device. The screen was black, unresponsive to any input. I checked my own phone. Dead. Completely, utterly dead, despite being at 80% charge when we'd started the hike just 4 hours earlier. Okay, that's not normal, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. All 4 phones dying simultaneously? That doesn't happen. Solar flare activity, Robert suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Can disrupt electronics. We found a fallen log that spanned the narrow part of the stream. Robert went first, his usual methodical approach turning each step into a careful test of balance. The log held, slick but solid. Jennifer followed, then Sarah, both making it across without incident. I was last. Halfway across, the log shifted beneath my feet with a grinding sound like breaking bones. I looked down and saw something that made my vision blur with vertigo. The water directly below me was moving wrong, not flowing downstream like the rest, but swirling in a tight spiral, as if something massive was circling just beneath the surface. "Mike!" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You okay?" I forced myself to focus on the far bank, on my friends' concerned faces. 3 more steps, and I was across, though my hands were shaking as I gripped Jennifer's offered arm. "What was that about?" she asked. "Nothing, just the water looked strange for a second." But it wasn't nothing. Even now, I could hear that water behind us, and the sound it made was different. Not the natural rush of a mountain stream, but something else. Something that sounded almost like whispering. The clearing Jennifer had chosen was exactly where her research indicated it would be. A rough circle of relatively flat ground, surrounded by towering pines whose tops disappeared into the darkening sky. In the center, a ring of blackened stones marked where previous campers had built fires. "Perfect," Jennifer said, but her enthusiasm sounded forced. "We can have the tents up in no time." Setting up camp should have been routine. We'd all done this before, multiple times, but everything went wrong in small, inexplicable ways. Tent stakes that should have driven easily into the soft earth bent and broke against what felt like solid rock just inches down. Sleeping bags that had been carefully rolled that morning came out of their stuff sacks damp and musty, despite the dry day. My camp stove, which I'd tested just the week before, refused to light no matter what I tried. "Here, let me try," Robert said, taking the stove. He had that look he got when technology wasn't behaving, a mix of irritation and determination. But after 10 minutes of systematic troubleshooting, he had to admit defeat. "It's like the gas isn't reaching the burner," he said, "but the tank is full and the connections are tight." "We'll build a fire," Sarah said. "Old school." But the fire wouldn't catch either. The kindling Jennifer had gathered looked dry, but it crumbled to damp ash in our hands. Robert's newspaper, he still carried physical newspapers claiming they were more reliable than digital news, wouldn't ignite even when I held my lighter directly to it for a full minute. "This is getting ridiculous," I muttered, watching the flame dance across the paper without catching. "Maybe the air's too humid," Jennifer suggested, but we could all see our breath in the cooling evening air, hardly a sign of excessive moisture. Finally, Sarah found some old paper trash in her pack, candy wrappers and such, and these caught immediately, burning with an odd blue-green flame that cast strange shadows among the trees. We fed the fire with increasing desperation, using whatever would burn. It gave off an acrid smoke that made our eyes water and left a metallic taste in our mouths, but it was warmth and light, and we clung to it. We ate cold food from cans and tried to pretend everything was normal. But the conversation kept dying, falling into uncomfortable silences filled only by the snap and hiss of our unnatural fire and the growing chorus of night sounds from the forest around us. And those sounds were wrong too. Instead of the familiar hoots of owls or the distant howl of coyotes, we heard things that didn't belong. A rhythmic tapping that sounded almost like Morse code, a low humming that seemed to come from the trees themselves, and underneath it all, a sound like breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate breathing coming from multiple directions at once. "You guys hear that?" Sarah whispered around at 10 o'clock. We all did. The breathing had grown louder, more obvious. It came in perfect synchronization, as if the entire forest was inhaling and exhaling as one massive lung. "Wind through the trees," Robert said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Rob," Jennifer said quietly, "there is no wind." She was right. The air was perfectly still. Our fire burned straight up without even a flicker to indicate air movement. Yet the breathing continued, growing louder, closer. "We should get some sleep," I said, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. "Long hike back tomorrow." We retreated to our tents, but sleep didn't come. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to that horrible synchronized breathing and trying to convince myself it was just the sound of blood rushing in my ears. But every few minutes, the rhythm would skip a beat, or pause entirely for long, terrifying moments before resuming. Around midnight, I heard Jennifer's tent zipper, footsteps padding around our campsite. Then her voice, soft but urgent. Rob, are you awake?" A rustling from Robert's tent, then his voice, thick with forced sleep. "What is it?" I need to go to the bathroom. Will you come with me? I don't want to go alone." "Jen, just use the camp toilet we set up." "I can't. Something's wrong with it. Please?" More rustling, then Robert's zipper opening. "Fine, but make it quick." I heard them walking away from camp, their footsteps growing fainter. Then silence except for that damned breathing from the trees. They were gone for 20 minutes. When they returned, I heard them whispering by the dying fire, but I couldn't make out the words, just the urgent, frightened tone that told me Jennifer had seen something in the darkness that had shaken her badly. The next thing I knew, gray dawn light was filtering through my tent walls. I'd fallen asleep at some point despite everything, and now I felt groggy and disoriented. My sleeping bag was soaked with cold sweat, and I had vague memories of nightmares filled with reaching shadows and teeth. Outside, I could hear the others moving around camp, but something was off about the sounds. Too quiet. Too careful. I unzipped my tent and emerged to find Sarah crouched by the fire pit, staring at the cold ashes with an expression of confusion and fear. "Where are Jen and Rob?" I asked. She looked up at me, and I saw that her face was pale, almost gray in the morning light. "I thought they were with you." "With me?" "No, I heard them get up during the night, but—" "Mike." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at this." She pointed to the ground around our campsite. In the soft earth, clear as day, were footprints. But not just human footprints. These were something else entirely. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And they circled our camp in a perfect ring, as if something had spent the night walking around and around our tents, just beyond the reach of our firelight. "Those weren't there yesterday," I said, though part of me wondered if we'd simply been too tired and distracted to notice. "Mike, look at the pattern." She was right to sound frightened. The prints didn't show the random wandering of an animal. They were deliberate, measured, methodical. Whatever had made them had been studying us. "Where the hell are Jen and Rob?" I said, raising my voice toward the tree line. "Jennifer! Robert!" Sarah called out, cupping her hands around her mouth. No answer. Just that oppressive silence we'd noticed the day before, now somehow even more complete. "They're tents," I said, rushing over to check. Jennifer's tent was empty, her sleeping bag neatly rolled and placed at the foot of the space, as if she'd cleaned up before leaving. But Robert's tent was worse. It was empty too, but his sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside and spread out flat, as if he'd simply vanished while lying in it. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, her voice rising toward panic. "People don't just disappear. Maybe they went for an early hike, to scout the trail back or something." But neither of us believed it. Jennifer was too much of a planner to wander off without leaving a note, and Robert would never leave his precious gear unattended. We spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling their names and looking for any sign of where they might have gone. We found nothing. No footprints leading away from camp, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped items. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. "We need to go get help," I said finally. "With what? Our phones are dead. We don't know exactly where we are, and we don't even know which direction leads back to the trail." She was right. In our panic, I'd lost track of which way we'd come from. The forest looked the same in every direction, an endless maze of trees and shadows. "We'll follow the stream back," I said. "Downstream should lead us toward civilization eventually." But when we reached White Oak Run, we found something that made my knees weak with terror. The water was flowing uphill. I stood there staring at it for a full minute before my brain would accept what my eyes were seeing. The stream we'd crossed yesterday, the stream that had been flowing from east to west, was now moving in the opposite direction, defying every law of physics I thought I understood. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. "I know." "Water doesn't flow uphill." "I know." "Then what the fuck is happening here?" I didn't have an answer. The world had stopped making sense somewhere between our friends vanishing and water deciding gravity was optional. We followed the stream anyway, hoping that its impossible upstream direction might somehow lead us to an explanation, or at least to a way out. But after an hour of hiking, we found ourselves back at our campsite. "How?" Sarah demanded, spinning in a slow circle. "How are we back here? We've been walking in a straight line." I couldn't answer. The mathematics of it hurt my head. We'd followed the stream for an hour, never turning, never backtracking, yet somehow we'd ended up exactly where we started. "We're going in circles," I said weakly. "That's impossible. The stream goes in a straight line." "Then explain how we're back here." She couldn't. Neither could I. That's when we heard the voices. "Mike! Sarah! Where are you guys?" It was Jennifer's voice coming from the direction we'd just walked. Clear and unmistakable, though with an odd echo that made it sound like she was calling from the bottom of a well. "Jennifer!" Sarah screamed, running toward the sound. "Wait!" I grabbed her arm. "Something's wrong." "What are you talking about? It's Jen." But I could hear what Sarah couldn't or wouldn't. Yes, it was Jennifer's voice, but it was off somehow. The cadence was wrong, the inflection strange, like someone trying to imitate Jennifer without quite getting it right. "Jennifer," the voice called again. "We're lost. We need help." Sarah broke free from my grip and ran toward the trees. I had no choice but to follow, crashing through the underbrush as we chased the sound of our missing friend's voice. We found them in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from camp. Jennifer and Robert, standing with their backs to us, perfectly still. "Jen!" Sarah called out, relief flooding her voice. "Rob, thank God you're okay." But they didn't turn around. They just stood there, motionless, facing away from us. "Guys," Sarah approached them slowly. "Are you all right?" That's when I noticed their clothes. Clean. Dry. No mud, no snagged fabric from pushing through the dense forest. They looked like they'd just stepped out of a hotel room. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "turn around." She did, and the thing that looked like Jennifer Davis turned to face us with a smile that was too wide, showing too many teeth. It was Jennifer, but wrong. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like looking into deep water. And that smile. That horrible, too wide smile that stretched further than human facial muscles should allow. "Hello, Mike," she said in Jennifer's voice. "We were looking for you." Robert turned next, and he was worse. His head rotated a full 180 degrees while his body remained perfectly still, the bones in his neck making audible popping sounds with each degree of movement. When he faced us, I could see that his mouth was moving constantly, opening and closing in a rhythm that matched the breathing we'd heard all night, though no sound emerged. "Run," I whispered to Sarah. She was frozen, staring at our friends with an expression of complete incomprehension. Her mind simply couldn't process what she was seeing. "Sarah, run." That broke her paralysis. We turned and fled through the forest, crashing through branches and undergrowth with no thought for direction or safety. Behind us, I could hear them following. Not running, but walking with measured, deliberate steps that somehow kept pace with our panicked sprint. And they were laughing. Jennifer's laugh, but doubled, echoing strangely as if it was coming from two different sources at once. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a massive fallen tree. I pressed my ear to the ground, listening for pursuit, but heard only silence. "What were those things?" Sarah gasped. "I don't know." "They looked like Jen and Rob." "I know. But they weren't. They couldn't be." I couldn't argue with that. Whatever we'd seen wearing our friends' faces, it hadn't been human. The way Robert's head had turned, the way Jennifer's smile had stretched beyond the limits of human anatomy, these were not things people could do. "We have to get out of here," I said. "How? We're lost, our phones are dead, and apparently the laws of physics don't work here." She was right, but giving up wasn't an option. "We'll find the trail. We'll follow it back to the road." What if those things follow us? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. We spent the rest of the day trying to find the trail we'd hiked in on, but every path we followed led us in circles, or dead-ended in impenetrable thickets, or simply vanished after a few hundred yards as if the forest was actively rearranging itself to confuse us. As evening approached, we found ourselves back at our original campsite once again. "This isn't possible," Sarah said, sitting heavily on a log. "We've been walking all day. We should be miles from here." But here we were, looking at the cold remains of our fire and the disturbed earth where our tents had been. Everything exactly as we'd left it that morning. "We'll have to spend another night," I said, though the thought made my stomach clench with dread. I can't. Mike, I can't spend another night here. We don't have a choice." As if to emphasize the point, darkness was already falling with that unnatural speed we'd noticed the day before. In the growing gloom, I thought I could see shapes moving between the trees. Tall, thin figures that might have been shadows, or might have been something worse. We rebuilt the fire using more of Sarah's trash, once again getting that eerie blue-green flame that cast writhing shadows in all directions. The forest around us came alive with those same wrong sounds. The breathing, the tapping, the low humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "They're out there," Sarah whispered. I knew she was right. I could feel them watching us from the darkness beyond our small circle of light. Patient. Waiting. "Mike! Sarah!" Jennifer's voice again, calling from the forest. But this time I was ready for it. "Don't answer," I told Sarah. "Don't even look." "We know you can hear us," the thing with Robert's voice added. "We just want to talk." "Why won't you come see us?" Jennifer's voice continued. "We're your friends." The voices circled our camp, sometimes close enough that I thought I could see movement in the shadows, sometimes seeming to come from impossible distances. They pleaded and cajoled, using memories and inside jokes that only the real Jennifer and Robert would know, trying to convince us to leave our fire and join them in the darkness. We didn't. But around midnight, something changed. The voices stopped. The forest went completely silent. No breathing, no humming, no sound at all except the crackle of our fire. Then Sarah stood up. "Sarah," I said, "what are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just started walking toward the tree line with the same measured, deliberate pace we'd seen from the things that looked like our friends. I jumped up and grabbed her arm. "Sarah, stop." She turned to look at me and her eyes were solid black. "Hello, Mike," she said in her own voice. "Join us." I jerked my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. The thing that looked like Sarah smiled that same too wide smile, showing far too many teeth, then continued walking into the forest. I was alone. I sat by that fire for the rest of the night, feeding it everything I could find while shapes moved in the darkness around me. They tried Sarah's voice now, along with Jennifer's and Robert's, calling to me in perfect imitations of my friends. But I could see them out there in the shifting shadows. Tall, impossibly thin figures with too many joints and movements that belonged more to insects than humans. When dawn finally came, I started walking. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just picked a path and followed it, determined to keep moving until I found a way out or died trying. This time, something was different. Maybe the things in the forest were sleeping during daylight. Or maybe I'd finally broken whatever spell had been keeping me trapped in that impossible loop. The forest around me began to change, becoming less dense, less oppressive. After 3 hours of steady hiking, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world: traffic. I crashed through the last line of trees and onto Highway 211, 20 miles from where we'd started our hike. A passing motorist found me collapsed on the shoulder, dehydrated and half delirious, babbling about friends who'd been replaced by monsters. The search and rescue team found our campsite the next day. They found my friends' tents, their gear, even their identification. But they never found Jennifer Davis, Robert Johnson, or Sarah Rodriguez. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, victims of the wilderness. But I know better. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear their voices calling to me, Jennifer's laugh echoing through my apartment, Robert's methodical explanations of things that don't make sense, Sarah's infectious enthusiasm, now carrying an undertone of something hungry and predatory. They want me to come back, to join them in whatever they've become. And the truly terrifying part is that sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I'm tempted. Because the thing is, I'm not entirely sure I escaped. Yesterday, I caught my reflection in a mirror and noticed my smile was just a little too wide. This morning, I blinked and for just a moment, my eyes looked completely black. And tonight, I heard myself calling to someone from the darkness outside their window, using my own voice to invite them into something terrible. I think whatever took my friends in those Virginia mountains isn't finished with me yet. I think it followed me home, patient and persistent, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever transformation it started. I think I'm becoming one of them. And the worst part? Part of me is starting to want it. The hunger is growing stronger every day. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Virginia's Massanutten Mountains, about 40 miles southwest of Front Royal, where the old logging roads disappear into hollows that maps forgot to mention. Brandon Edwards and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. We'd both been drowning in our office jobs, him in accounting, me in IT support, and desperately needed to disconnect from the digital world that had been slowly suffocating us. The Massanutten Range seemed perfect, remote enough to guarantee solitude, challenging enough to feel like an accomplishment. but not so treacherous that two moderately experienced hikers couldn't handle it. Brandon was my college roommate, the kind of guy who measured everything twice and packed emergency supplies for emergencies. Methodical, cautious, always thinking 3 steps ahead. I was the opposite, spontaneous, trusting my gut, the type who figured problems would sort themselves out. We balanced each other perfectly, which is why our friendship had survived 15 years and countless adventures. The plan was simple: 3 days hiking the lesser-known trails around Massanutten Peak, camping at designated backcountry sites, then hiking out via the old Duncan Hollow Trail. We'd researched the route obsessively, downloaded offline maps, checked weather forecasts, filed our hiking plan with the rangers. Everything by the book. The first sign something was wrong came before we even reached the trailhead. Our GPS led us down Route 678 toward Duncan Hollow Road, but the turnoff wasn't where it should have been. The road continued straight where our downloaded maps showed it should curve left. Brandon pulled over, frowning at his phone. "That's weird," he muttered, swiping between map applications. "This doesn't match what we planned." I leaned over to look. The satellite imagery showed dense forest where the road supposedly continued. Maybe the maps are outdated? Let's keep going and see if we can find another way in. We drove for another 10 minutes before spotting a hand-painted sign reading Duncan Hollow Ard, nailed to a crooked post. The road was barely more than 2 tire ruts carved through overgrown brush. Nothing like the gravel Forest Service road we'd expected. "This can't be right," Brandon said, but I was already feeling that familiar itch to explore. "Come on, man. Adventure, remember? We wanted to get away from civilization." He hesitated, then put the car in drive. "If we get stuck out here, we won't." The road wound deeper into the mountains, becoming increasingly primitive. Branches scraped against the windows. The canopy grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. After 20 minutes of bone-jarring driving, we reached a small clearing with a weather-beaten trail marker that read Massanutten Peak Trail, 8.7 miles. We shouldered our packs and set off into the forest. The trail was well-maintained initially, marked with standard blue blazes every 100 yards. The October air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. Perfect hiking weather. For the first hour, everything felt normal. We fell into our usual rhythm, Brandon setting a steady pace, me pointing out interesting rock formations or unusual trees. The trail climbed gradually through mixed hardwood forest, past moss-covered boulders and small streams that gurgled over smooth stones. But as we climbed higher, the forest began to feel different. Not wrong, exactly, just off. The bird songs became sparse, then stopped altogether. The quality of light seemed strange, too dim for mid-afternoon, with an odd greenish tint filtering through the leaves. "You notice how quiet it is?" Brandon asked during our first rest stop. I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. "Probably just the elevation. Or maybe hunting season started early." Brandon checked his phone. "No signal. That's not surprising up here." We continued climbing. The trail blazes became irregular, sometimes clustering together, sometimes absent for long stretches. I started feeling turned around, even though we'd been following a clear path. The trees all began to look identical. Tall, straight trunks disappearing into the gloom above, with very little undergrowth. "Ken," Brandon said after another hour, his voice tight, "look at this." He was staring at his compass, tapping the face with his finger. The needle was spinning slowly, never settling on a direction. I pulled out my own compass. Same thing. The needle wandered in lazy circles as if magnetic north had simply vanished. "Equipment malfunction," I said, but the words felt hollow. Both compasses? At the same time? We compared our backup navigation tools. Both GPS units showed our location as a gray void. The offline maps displayed nothing but empty pixels. Even our mechanical altimeter seemed confused, showing readings that fluctuated wildly with each step. "This is seriously weird," Brandon said. His methodical nature was warring with growing unease. "Maybe there's some kind of magnetic anomaly in the rock? Iron deposits or something?" I wanted to believe that explanation, but the forest felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with geology. The silence was too complete. Not just the absence of bird songs, but no insects, no wind in the trees, no small animals rustling through the underbrush. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the sound was being absorbed by something hungry. We pressed on because turning back felt somehow impossible. The trail continued upward, but I had the disturbing sensation that we were descending, spiraling down into something deep and patient. The sun, or what passed for it through the canopy, began to fade. We'd planned to reach the first campsite by 4 p.m., but my watch read 2:30, and the light was already dying. Time felt elastic, stretching and compressing unpredictably. "We should start looking for a place to camp," Brandon said. His voice carried that forced calm he used when he was genuinely worried. The designated campsite wasn't where it should have been. According to our maps, we should have found a cleared area with a fire ring and a nearby water source. Instead, the trail simply continued through endless identical forest. We eventually stopped at a small clearing that felt marginally less oppressive than the surrounding woods. Brandon began setting up his tent with mechanical precision while I gathered firewood. But the fallen branches I collected felt wrong in my hands. Too light, too dry, crumbling to powder at the slightest pressure. The fire wouldn't catch. The kindling would flare briefly, then die, as if something was stealing the oxygen. Even when flames did take hold, they burned with an odd color. Too blue, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. "The wood must be rotten," Brandon said, but he was staring at the flames with the same unease I felt. We ate a cold dinner of trail mix and energy bars. The food tasted like ash in my mouth. Even water from our bottles seemed flat and metallic. As darkness fell, the wrongness intensified. The night was absolutely silent. Not even the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of nocturnal creatures. But there was something out there. I could feel it watching us, patient and hungry. "Ken," Brandon whispered from inside his tent. "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears. At first, nothing. Then, barely audible, a sound like breathing. Not human breathing, something much larger, much slower. Each inhalation seemed to last forever, followed by an even longer pause before the exhale. The sound was coming from all around us, as if the forest itself was breathing. Neither of us slept. We lay in our sleeping bags, listening to that slow, rhythmic breathing and pretending we couldn't hear it. My watch hands seemed to move backwards sometimes, jumping from 11:47 to 11:23 to 12:15 in the space of minutes. Dawn, when it finally came, was gray and lifeless. The breathing stopped as light filtered through the trees, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. We broke camp quickly, neither of us acknowledging what we'd experienced. Brandon's tent was covered with a thin layer of frost despite the mild temperature, and my sleeping bag was damp with a moisture that smelled faintly of decay. The second day of hiking felt like walking through a fever dream. The trail continued to climb, but the landscape never changed. Same trees, same rocks, same patches of dying ferns. We passed landmarks that looked identical to ones we'd seen hours earlier. A fallen log with a distinctive split down the middle. A boulder shaped like a crouching figure. A dead tree with branches that formed an almost perfect cross. "Are we going in circles?" Brandon asked during our third rest stop. I'd been wondering the same thing. The trailblazes were getting stranger. Some were carved deep into the bark, others looked freshly painted, and a few seemed to pulse with their own dim light when I wasn't looking directly at them. "The trail's marked consistently," I said. "We must be making progress." But I was lying, and we both knew it. By afternoon, Brandon was stumbling. His usual steady pace had become erratic, and he kept stopping to stare at trees as if trying to recognize them. "Ken," he said suddenly, "what day is it?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't remember. We'd started hiking on Friday? Saturday? The days had blurred together into one endless gray period. "Does it matter?" I asked. He stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not confusion, but something deeper, as if he was looking at a stranger. "I need to find water," he said. "My bottles are empty." I looked at his pack. 2 full water bottles were clearly visible in the side pockets. "Brandon, your water's right there." He followed my gaze, then looked back at me with that same strange expression. "Those aren't mine." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean they're not yours? I watched you fill them yesterday." "Yesterday?" He laughed, but it wasn't his laugh. Too high, too long. "When was yesterday, Ken?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't. The events of our trip had become a confused jumble in my memory. Had we been hiking for 2 days? 3? A week? "I'm going to find a stream," Brandon said. He dropped his pack and walked off the trail, disappearing into the trees before I could stop him. I waited, and waited. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton, broken only by the slow, rhythmic breathing that had returned with the fading light. When Brandon came back, something was wrong. He emerged from the trees exactly where he disappeared, carrying his empty water bottles. But he moved differently, too smoothly, as if his feet weren't quite touching the ground. His clothes were clean and dry, despite having spent an hour bushwhacking through dense forest. "Find anything?" I asked. He smiled. It was Brandon's smile, but it lingered too long, showing too many teeth. "Found exactly what I was looking for." That night, we made camp in another clearing that looked identical to the previous one. The same arrangement of rocks, the same dead tree at the edge, the same patches of withered grass. As if the forest was recycling itself, showing us the same scene over and over. Brandon helped set up camp, but his movements were wrong. Too precise, too deliberate. When he spoke, there were long pauses between words, as if he was translating from another language. "Beautiful night," he said, staring up at a sky I couldn't see through the canopy. "Brandon, are you feeling okay?" He turned to look at me, and in the dying firelight his eyes reflected like an animal's. "Never better, Ken. Never better." I pretended to sleep, listening to him move around the campsite. But Brandon's movements had no sound, no footsteps, no rustling clothes, no breathing. He was perfectly, impossibly silent. Around midnight, I heard him unzip his tent. Through squinted eyes, I watched him walk to the edge of the clearing and stand motionless, staring into the dark forest. He stood there for hours, unmoving, like a statue. When morning came, he was back in his tent, snoring normally, but his sleeping bag was zipped from the outside. The 3rd day was when I started to understand what was happening to us. We broke camp and continued hiking, but Brandon's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would stop mid-sentence and stare into the forest, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. He forgot basic things: how to adjust his pack straps, which pocket held his map, my name. "Who are you again?" he asked during our morning break. "Ken. Kenneth Young. We've been friends for 15 years. He nodded slowly, but his eyes were blank. "Ken. Yes, I remember Ken." But he didn't. I could see it in his face. He was looking at me like I was a stranger wearing a familiar mask. The trail led us to what should have been Massanutten Peak, but instead of a summit, we found ourselves at the edge of a massive crater. The depression was perfectly round, maybe a quarter-mile across, filled with fog that moved against the wind. The smell rising from it was indescribable, like meat left too long in the sun, but with an underlying sweetness that made my mouth water despite my revulsion. "This isn't on the map," I said. Brandon was already climbing down into the crater. "Come on, Ken. It's beautiful down here." I grabbed his arm. His skin was cold, even through his jacket. "Brandon, stop." Something's wrong. This place isn't natural." He turned to look at me, and for a moment his expression cleared. The real Brandon was there, trapped behind his own eyes, screaming silently for help. "Ken," he whispered, "don't let it take you too. Run." Then his face went blank again and he smiled that too wide smile. "Just kidding. Come down, Ken. They're waiting for us." I backed away from the crater's edge. "Who's waiting?" "The hungry ones. They've been so patient, Ken. So very patient." I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, terror giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, I could hear Brandon, or the thing wearing Brandon's face, calling my name in a voice that grew less human with each repetition. The forest had become a maze. Trails appeared and disappeared. Trees rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. I ran uphill and found myself at the bottom of valleys. I ran east and ended up facing west. But something was guiding me. A faint path, barely visible, that led away from the crater and the breathing darkness and the thing that had been my friend. I followed it blindly, driven by pure instinct. Hours later, or maybe days, time had lost all meaning, I stumbled onto a paved road. An actual road, with yellow lines and guardrails and the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. A Virginia State Police cruiser parked on the shoulder. Officer Martinez found me collapsed next to his car, babbling about creatures and time distortions and friends who came back wrong. He was kind but skeptical, the way cops get when dealing with people who've been in the woods too long. "Son, you've been missing for 8 days, he said. "Your friend Brandon Edwards was found 3 days ago, wandering Route 678 in his underwear. He's in psychiatric evaluation at UVA Medical Center. Severe hypothermia, malnutrition, complete amnesia." 8 days. I'd lost 5 days somewhere in that forest. "He's not Brandon," I told Officer Martinez. "Whatever you found, it's not my friend." The officer gave me the look reserved for people who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. "Exposure can do strange things to the mind, son. You both need medical attention." I tried to explain about the crater, the breathing forest, the way time moved wrong. But how do you describe something that exists outside normal reality? How do you convince someone that the friend they found isn't human anymore? They took me to the hospital, where doctors examined me for signs of injury or illness. Physically, I was fine, dehydrated, a little underweight, but nothing that couldn't be explained by 8 days in the wilderness. Mentally, they weren't so sure. I asked to see Brandon, but they wouldn't let me. "He's not ready for visitors," they said. "He's still recovering from his trauma." I knew better. They weren't protecting Brandon. They were protecting everyone else from whatever had taken his place. That night, I snuck out of the hospital and found Brandon's room. He was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the parking lot. When he heard me enter, he turned around with that same too wide smile. "Ken," he said, "I was wondering when you'd visit." His voice was perfectly normal. Brandon's voice, Brandon's inflection. But his eyes were wrong. Too bright, too aware, like something ancient and hungry looking out from behind familiar features. "What are you?" I whispered. He tilted his head, considering the question. "I'm your friend Brandon Edwards. Don't you recognize me?" "Brandon's gone." "No, Ken. I'm right here. We went camping together, remember? In the beautiful forest where time moves differently and the hungry ones wait so patiently for visitors." He stood up, and despite his slight frame, he seemed to fill the room. "You left me there, Ken. You ran away and left me to feed them. That wasn't very friendly." I backed toward the door. "You're not Brandon." "I'm exactly Brandon. I have all his memories, all his thoughts, all his feelings. I know that you cheated on your SATs in high school. I know about the time you got drunk and kissed his girlfriend at that party senior year. I know about the night terrors you had after your father died." The details were perfect. Too perfect. Like someone had downloaded Brandon's entire personality and was running it as a program. "But I'm so much more than Brandon ever was," the thing continued. I'm connected to something vast and patient and eternally hungry. And you know what, Ken? I think you'd make a wonderful addition to our family. I ran again, this time out of the hospital and into my car. I drove straight through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was wearing my friend's face. That was 6 months ago. I've tried to move on, tried to convince myself it was all some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I know better, because Brandon calls me every few weeks. He sounds perfectly normal on the phone, cheerful, concerned about my well-being, wanting to get together for a drink and catch up. He mentions our camping trip sometimes, laughing about how we got lost and scared ourselves with ghost stories. But he never quite gets the details right. He talks about hiking for 3 days when we both know it was supposed to be 3 days but lasted 8. He mentions camping near a beautiful lake when there was no lake anywhere near Massanutten Peak. He describes finding an old cabin where we supposedly took shelter, complete with a friendly local who shared his dinner with us. None of it happened. He's creating false memories to replace whatever really occurred in that forest. Or maybe the thing wearing his face simply doesn't understand how human memory actually works. The worst part is that he's getting better at it. Each call, his stories become more detailed, more convincing. If I didn't know what I'd experienced, I might actually believe him. Last week, he suggested we plan another camping trip. "I know, a perfect spot," he said. "Really remote, no cell service, completely cut off from civilization. Just the two of us and nature." I told him I wasn't interested in camping anymore. "That's too bad, Ken," he said, and for just a moment his voice carried that same patient hunger I'd heard in the breathing forest. "I was really looking forward to introducing you to my new friends." I changed my phone number the next day, but I know it won't matter. Whatever took Brandon is patient, and it knows where to find me. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear that slow, rhythmic breathing outside my apartment. And sometimes, when I'm driving on remote roads, I see familiar blue blazes painted on trees that shouldn't have any trail markers at all. The forest is expanding, you see, growing stronger, and the hungry ones are always looking for new visitors to join their eternal family in the spaces between reality, where time moves wrong, and lost friends come back wearing faces that almost, but not quite, look right. I keep telling myself that Brandon is gone, that whatever I might see or hear or receive phone calls from isn't my friend. But late at night, when the breathing gets close enough to fog my windows, I wonder if maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Brandon is still alive in there somewhere, trapped inside something vast and patient and eternally hungry, watching helplessly as his body and voice are used to lure other unsuspecting friends into the dark places where the maps don't match and compasses spin uselessly and time itself becomes a predator. If you're reading this, if you ever find yourself on a trail where the blazes pulse with their own dim light and the forest breathes around you like a living thing, turn back. Don't trust your friends if they come back from gathering firewood too quiet, too clean, too willing to venture into places that feel wrong. And if someone you care about ever suggests a camping trip to a remote area where there's no cell service and no way to call for help, maybe suggest a nice hotel instead. The hungry ones are always patient, always waiting, and they're very, very good at wearing familiar faces.